second and just think back to elementary school or maybe middle school English class.
Oh, yeah. The classic poetry unit.
Right. Picture yourself sitting at that desk, pencil in hand, looking at this blank piece of lined paper. You are likely literally counting on your fingers, quietly mouthing words to yourself.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Exactly. 5 syllables on the first line, 7 syllables on the second line, 5 syllables on the third. It felt like a math equation just shoved into a poetry class, didn't it?
It really did.
It was rigid. It was binary, and it was presented as this ultimate test of your ability to follow rules. Like, if you hit that exact 575 count, congratulations, you wrote a haiku.
You pass.
Yeah. And if you came in at, say, 4 or 6 syllables on that first line, you completely failed the assignment. It felt incredibly clean, universally agreed upon, and just absolute.
Well, it is entirely presented to us as this universal, unbreakable law of poetry. We are taught to view that structure almost like a law of physics. Like, gravity makes things fall, and haiku is 5, 7, 5. It's so ingrained in our educational system as the defining characteristic of the form, to the point where the syllable count completely eclipses any discussion about the actual content or the spirit of the poem itself.
But what if I told you that almost everything we were taught about that 5-7-5 structure, that entire rigid system we all stressed over as kids, is essentially just a massive misunderstanding?
It's a huge myth.
It is. Okay, so let's unpack this, because today we are going deep into the real story of haiku. And to do that, we are leaning heavily on a honestly monumental and incredibly detailed 2-part essay by poet and critic Charles Trumbull.
Yeah, originally published in the journal Modern Haiku back in 2005 and 2006.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace the actual, surprisingly chaotic and highly contested journey of haiku. We're talking about a path that takes us from an exotic curiosity in 19th century Europe through these fierce and bitter literary debates in the American avant-garde, all the way to its current status as a fully independent, borderless global art form in our modern internet age.
And setting the stage for this discussion, I think it is vital to understand that we are not just talking about line breaks and punctuation and syllables.
No, not at all.
That is just the surface level.
Yeah.
What we are really exploring is a profound story of cultural translation. This is a case study in how ideas completely mutate when they cross oceans.
Right.
It's about severe misinterpretation, necessary adaptation, and ultimately an art form fighting for and winning its own distinct artistic independence. The journey of haiku in the West perfectly illustrates how cultures collide and borrow from one another, often getting it, well, completely backwards for decades before finally getting to the truth of the matter.
So let's start at the beginning of its Western journey. And immediately, the sources just flip our geographical assumptions entirely upside down. If you were to ask someone today, how did Japanese poetry reach the American literary scene, logic kind of suggests it traveled straight across the Pacific Ocean.
Sure, a direct line.
Yeah, a direct line of cultural exchange from Tokyo to San Francisco, especially when you consider the large populations of Japanese immigrants on the West Coast. But Trumbull's research shows that is not what happened at all.
Not even close.
It took a massive detour. It actually came to America through Europe.
Right. The true genesis of the Western haiku movement actually begins with the absolute explosion of Japanese art's popularity in Europe during the late 19th century.
Okay.
Historians call this era Japonisme. So after Japan was forced to open its borders to the West in the 1850s, European markets were suddenly just flooded with Japanese goods. And what's fascinating is how the artistic transmission actually happened here.
Tell me about the wrapping paper, because this blew my mind.
It's incredible. So these magnificent Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints were literally being used as cheap wrapping paper to protect imported porcelain.
Wow.
And European artists, people like Monet, Degas, and Van Gogh, they saw this quote-unquote wrapping paper, and their minds were completely blown.
I mean, imagine being Van Gogh and just unwrapping a teacup and seeing a masterpiece.
Exactly. They saw these flat planes of color, a total lack of traditional Western perspective, and this intense asymmetrical focus on the natural world. France, specifically, became the epicenter of this obsession, and it served as the crucial gateway for haiku entering the Western consciousness.
France. It's wild to think of Paris as the incubator for Japanese poetry. But the timeline we have here is incredible. The very first French translations of haiku started appearing around 1903. And in that exact same year, there's this amazing historical anecdote.
The boat trip.
The boat trip. 3 French writers, Paul-Louis Cruchot, Albert Ponsin and André Faure, were on a boat trip together, just floating down a canal. They had been reading these early translations, and they decided to, well, try it themselves.
Why not? Right.
Right. They ended up writing 72 original haikus right there on the water, which they published anonymously as a collection. Just put yourself in that scene. You've got these French intellectuals in 1903 in their waistcoats floating along a French waterway, attempting to capture an ancient Japanese philosophical aesthetic using the French language.
It is a phenomenal image, and it really captures the sheer infectious novelty of the form at that time. They weren't just reading it. They felt immediately compelled to try and replicate it. And it did not stop as a quirky experiment on a boat.
No.
By the time we approached World War I, haiku was firmly established in French literary circles. It had a massive impact on the French symbolist poets of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And from that Parisian hub, it started rippling outward across the continent.
Like who?
Well, you had the German poet Arno Holz, who visited Paris in 1887, absorbed this whole Japanism influence, and then brought the concepts back to Germany to experiment with his own language.
Okay.
The transmission was so pervasive that you even had the legendary Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke writing original haikus in French around 1920.
Wait, really? Early?
Yes, Rilke.
Yeah.
France's connection to haiku became so foundational that a century later, in 2003, they celebrated the anniversary of that boat trip by publishing a massive anthology and officially founding the French Haiku Society.
Okay, so if I am tracking this geographical bouncing ball correctly, the poetry starts in Japan, it gets translated, likely quite roughly, into French.
Very roughly.
It inspires the German and Austrian writers, and then, after soaking in all that European artistic theory, it finally crosses the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean. The British and American poets pick it up, specifically a group known as the Imagists.
Right.
And we are talking about heavy hitters of Western literature here. Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, T.E. Holm, John Goldfletcher. But they were getting their inspiration primarily from the French symbolists, who got it from early French translations of Japanese texts. Now, this is where I see a major red flag in the history.
The translation chain.
Yeah. This sounds exactly like a giant transcontinental game of poetic telephone. When you translate a Japanese poem into French, and then an American poet reads that French translation and tries to write an English poem based on it, doesn't the original soul of the art get entirely lost in transmission?
That poetic telephone analogy is highly accurate, and your skepticism is totally well-founded here.
Yeah.
The early Western influence was, in many cases, highly superficial. Because of that chain of translation, these British and American poets were relying on texts that simply couldn't convey the linguistic and philosophical depths of the Japanese originals. The cultural gap was just immense. Often these early translations emphasized the exotic, foreign nature of the poems. They viewed them as quaint, delicate little oddities from the mysterious East, rather than profound, rigorous pieces of literature.
So they were basically treating it like a literary souvenir, something you put on a shelf to show how worldly you are without actually understanding the mechanics of how it was built.
Precisely. And the frustration of trying to write in this form without truly understanding its underlying mechanics led to severe disillusionment for some of them. In fact, John Goldfletcher, one of the most prominent of those Imagist poets, he flat out declared in 1918 that it was fundamentally impossible to write a good haiku in the English language.
Wow.
He looked at the structural differences between English and Japanese and effectively just threw his hands up in defeat.
Wait, okay, so if the translations were poor, the cultural gap was massive, and major poets were publicly declaring that the English language was simply incompatible with the form, why didn't it just die out? Why didn't the Imagists just drop it and move on to something else?
Because of what the underlying philosophy of haiku offered them, even in its diluted, translated state. To understand their obsession, we have to look at the larger context of Western literature at the end of the 19th century.
Setting the scene.
Yeah. Victorian poetry had become incredibly bloated. It was overly sentimental, drowning in adjectives, obsessed with long, meandering emotional declarations, and heavily reliant on rigid, predictable rhyming structures.
Very flowery.
Exactly. The Imagists were desperately looking for a way out of that suffocating stylistic trap. They wanted poetry to be sharp, concrete, and real.
And suddenly here comes this Japanese form that does exactly that.
Exactly. The core characteristics of haiku, its extreme brevity, its total objectivity, its reliance on concrete realism, and a ruthlessly minimalist approach, they acted as a much-needed tonic for Western literature. It was the cure for their bloated poetic language.
Yeah, makes sense.
They didn't need to perfectly understand the Japanese rules. They just needed the concept of doing more with less. And Ezra Pound played the absolute pivotal role here. Pound was deeply inspired by those French art circles, but he also had a direct connection to a Japanese poet named Yonen Noguchi, who had been living in the United States. Noguchi, by the way, is widely believed to have written the very first original haiku in English.
So Pound is looking at Noguchi's work, and he sees a weapon. He sees a way to violently cut away all that Victorian fat.
Yes. Pound saw in haiku the perfect distilled model for what he wanted all modern English poetry to become. He used its minimalist principles as a crowbar to pry English poetry away from sentimentality. Think of his famous two-line poem, In a Station of the Metro.
Oh, right.
The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough.
It's beautiful.
It is. Now, that isn't technically a traditional haiku, but it is entirely built on the haiku aesthetic. There are no verbs, no moralizing, just two concrete images placed side by side to create a spark of realization. Pound took this aesthetic from a niche French artistic obsession and injected it directly into the mainstream bloodstream of English and American poetry.
That is wild. American and British poets use this ancient, rigid Japanese form to basically invent modern, free-flowing English poetry. But I was reading ahead in Trumbull's essay, and this is where the historical narrative presents a massive, almost comical irony.
Oh, the timing is amazing.
It really is.
Right.
While all these Western poets, Pound, Lowell, Fletcher, were agonizing over how to capture the strict, ancient, objective realism of traditional Japanese haiku, what was actually happening back in Japan during the exact same time period.
A total, unmitigated rebellion against those very traditions.
The West is trying to build a museum for traditional haiku, and the Japanese poets are actively burning the museum down. Let's talk about the Japanese Gendai Revolution, because this completely shatters our preconceived notions.
It does. The term Gendai simply means modern or contemporary in Japanese. And the Gendai haiku movement, which gained massive momentum in 20th century Japan, was a radical, aggressive departure from everything the West thought haiku was supposed to be.
Right.
For over 3 centuries, dating back to masters like Basho, traditional Japanese haiku relied on incredibly strict rules. But the pioneers of Gendai haiku, figures like Tanita Sentoka and Ozaki Hosai, they looked at that rigid heritage and completely abandoned it.
And when you say abandon, you don't mean they just tweaked the syllable count a little bit. They threw the entire rule book out the window.
They demolished it. They opted for what is known as free form. They were no longer interested in being objective, egoless observers of nature, which was the classical ideal. They wanted extreme self-expression. They wanted total freedom of thought, unfettered emotion, and internal psychology to be the center of the poem.
A complete 180.
Completely. And it went far beyond just ignoring the structural metrics. The Gendai New Wave completely discarded the classical, formal Japanese language that had always been the hallmark of the art form. They started writing in vibrant, gritty, contemporary, everyday vernacular.
Which makes sense. If you are trying to write about the reality of the 20th century, you can't use the vocabulary of a 17th century aristocrat.
Precisely. And this linguistic shift allowed haiku to become highly politicized. By the time we get to the 1930s, this evolution had spawned proletarian and leftist haiku movements in Japan. Poets were using this incredibly short form to document poverty, industrialization, and class struggle.
Wow.
Yeah, stripping away the aristocratic language and using street vernacular to describe factory smoke instead of cherry blossoms was a profound political act. And after World War II, you saw the rise of highly socially conscious, avant-garde haiku that was specifically designed to provoke controversy, challenge societal norms, and process the trauma of the post-war era.
So imagine an American reader in the 1950s. They have been taught by their school teachers that a haiku is a serene, objective, mathematically precise nature poem about a frog jumping into a pond. If that American suddenly picked up a translated Gendai haiku, what would they even be looking at?
They would be utterly bewildered. To a Western reader accustomed to the traditional stereotype, Gendai haiku often feels highly abstract, intensely subjective, and sometimes completely surreal. It doesn't look, sound, or function like the haiku they had spent decades trying to mimic. There is a famous, defining quote from a prominent Gendai poet named Natsushi Baniya that perfectly sums up the attitude of this entire movement. He declared simply, "Gendai haiku is the haiku I write."
Gendai haiku is the haiku I write. That is the ultimate statement of artistic individualism.
Mm.
He is basically saying, the rules are whatever I decide they are the moment I pick up the pen. My existence defines the form.
Exactly. It prioritized individual originality over adherence to any inherited tradition. Trumbull's essay provides a really helpful breakdown to contrast these two paradigms.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at the metrics. First, form. Traditional haiku demands 17 sound symbols arranged in a specific pattern. Gendai haiku demands absolute free form. It can be one word or 20.
A completely different structural foundation.
Then look at seasonality. Traditional haiku strictly requires a kigo, a mandatory, officially recognized season word that anchors the poem in a specific time of year. Gendai haiku makes seasonality entirely optional. You can write a poem about a concrete room with no windows, devoid of nature entirely.
Right.
Let's look at language. Traditional uses classical formal diction. Gendai uses modern, lively, sometimes harsh or vulgar contemporary language.
It's the difference between reading Shakespeare and reading a modern slam poem.
Yes. And the focus represents the most drastic philosophical shift. Traditional haiku strives for an objective observation of the natural world, deliberately removing the poet's ego. The poet is just a lens. Gendai haiku dives deep into the subjective, the surreal, and the internal psychology of the poet. The poet is the subject. And finally, the ultimate standard for success. The standard for traditional haiku was how well you adhered to the legacy of the masters and maintained the form's purity. The standard for Gendai was sheer, unfiltered, individual originality.
It is a stunning dichotomy. The Americans are desperately trying to learn how to play classical piano by the book, and meanwhile, the Japanese are smashing the piano with a sledgehammer and calling it jazz.
That's a great way to put it.
But speaking of Americans pushing boundaries and embracing a sort of jazz aesthetic, let's trace this timeline into the 1950s. Because haiku couldn't stay locked up in the highbrow academic circles of the imagists forever. If it was going to survive, it needed a vehicle to reach the mainstream American consciousness. And that vehicle arrived wearing a leather jacket, hitchhiking across the country, and playing bongo drums. We are talking about the Beat generation.
Ah, yes. The Beats were absolutely crucial in popularizing haiku in America, really shifting it from academic theory to a lived countercultural practice. We're talking about literary icons like Jack Kerouac, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, Diane di Prima, and Kenneth Rexroth.
Legends.
In the 1950s, this group of rebellious anti-establishment poets became deeply drawn to Eastern philosophy, and specifically to Zen Buddhism.
And it wasn't just a casual aesthetic choice for them either. If you look at the sources, Kerouac literally wrote entire collections dedicated to the form, like American Haikus and Book of Haikus. You have Ginsberg publishing mostly sitting haiku. They were obsessed.
Totally obsessed.
And they weren't relying on those terrible French translations from 50 years prior anymore. They were getting their information from much better sources, like the monumental haiku volumes translated by R.H. Blythe, as well as the philosophical writings of D.T. Suzuki on Zen Buddhism.
And we really need to explore why Zen philosophy aligns so perfectly with their goals. A core concept in Zen is Satori's light, a sudden, unexplainable flash of enlightenment or awakening.
Yeah.
You cannot write a sprawling 40-page epic poem about a sudden flash of insight. By the time you write the second stanza, the flash is gone. You need a form that takes exactly one breath to say. The Beats recognized that the brevity and the concrete reality of haiku made it the perfect literary vehicle for capturing Satori.
That makes perfect sense.
Much like the Imagists a few decades prior, the Beats used haiku as a literary cure against the conformity and consumerism of 1950s America. But the Beats brought something the Imagists didn't have: massive cultural star power.
Yeah, they were famous.
They brought a raw, glamorous, subversive energy to haiku. They made it cool to a generation of young people looking for alternative ways to view the world.
I agree they made it cool, but I have to play devil's advocate here based on the readings.
Yeah.
When I look at how the Beats actually utilize the form, it feels to me like they treated haiku less as a rigorous, disciplined, poetic art form with specific aesthetic requirements and more like a spiritual diary entry. It was almost like, hey, I saw a cool bird while I was drinking wine on a mountain. Let me jot down 3 lines about it, and because I'm a Zen bohemian, it automatically counts as a haiku. They kind of conflated their own spontaneity with actual philosophical rigor. So I have to challenge this narrative. Did the Beats actually build the structural foundation of American haiku, or did they just use their celebrity to turn it into a trendy, somewhat superficial fad?
That is a highly debated point, and Trumbull's essay provides a very nuanced answer to that. The reality is a division of labor.
Okay.
The Beats brought the audience, They brought the enthusiasm, the spotlight, and the cultural relevance.
Yeah.
But they did not build the structural groundwork. They were the promoters, not the architects.
Right.
The actual rigorous heavy lifting of establishing American haiku as the legitimate literary discipline with defensible aesthetic standards was done quietly behind the scenes by scholars and translators. Primarily, we are talking about two monumental figures, Harold Henderson and R.H. Blythe.
The unsung academic heroes who were actually figuring out how the engine worked while the Beats were just painting flames on the hood of the car.
A perfect way to put it. Harold Henderson, in particular, was the foundational architect. He published a landmark book in 1958 called An Introduction to Haiku, and then followed it up in 1965 with Haiku in English.
And that second one was huge.
That 1965 book was effectively the very first textbook ever written on how to write Western haiku. It wasn't just a collection of poems, it was a manual. And within that manual, Henderson made a philosophical argument that changed the entire trajectory of the art form in the West. He argued that the strict Japanese rules were not immutable laws of nature. They were conventions.
That distinction between a law and a convention is massive. A law implies that if you break it, the thing you created is factually invalid. A convention just means, this is the agreed upon tradition of how we generally do things in our specific culture.
Exactly. Henderson understood linguistics deeply. He understood that you cannot force the English language to behave exactly like the Japanese language. The machineries of the two languages are fundamentally different. He predicted with incredible accuracy that while Americans desperately needed to study the classical Japanese conventions to understand the spirit and the intent of the art form, they would inevitably have to build their own independent standards that made organic sense for the English language.
Okay, so if Henderson is pointing out that we are dealing with two entirely different linguistic machines, and that the Japanese rules are just cultural conventions that we need to adapt rather than blindly obey, we have to finally address the elephant in the room.
Let's do it.
The biggest, most famous convention of all, the one we started this entire conversation with, the infamous 575-syllable count. Because this is where the entire elementary school curriculum falls apart, and frankly, where the biggest public misconception lies today.
It is the most pervasive, stubbornly entrenched myth in Western poetry. And it all comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of linguistics. Traditional Japanese haiku does not count syllables in the way we understand that word in English.
Right.
It relies on a count of 17 onji, which are better translated as sound symbols or phonetic units. Japanese is what linguists call a mora-timed language.
Let's pause here and really dig into the mechanics of this, because I think if you don't grasp this linguistic reality, you can't understand why American haiku had to change. What is the actual difference between an English syllable and a Japanese onji? Because they do not carry the same weight.
We're never close. An onji or a mora is a very short, highly consistent unit of sound duration. The rhythm of Japanese is relatively flat and even. Let's look at the word haiku itself.
Okay.
In English, we pronounce it as two syllables. Haiku. We stress the first syllable. But in Japanese, it is composed of three distinct onji haiku, 3 equal beats of time. Right. English, on the other hand, is a stress-timed language. Our syllables are incredibly variable in length, weight, and the amount of phonetic data they contain. The word a is one English syllable. The word strengths is also one English syllable.
I love that example. Strengths. Look at that word. It has a complex consonant cluster at the beginning, STR, a vowel in the middle, and another massive consonant cluster at the end, NGTHS.
Yeah.
It takes a full second of breath to articulate all those sounds. It contains a huge amount of linguistic data, and yet, technically, it is exactly one syllable.
Precisely. So an English syllable can contain vastly more imagery, more meaning, and more phonetic weight than a single simple Japanese onji.
I was trying to conceptualize this while reading the sources, and the best way I can think to describe trying to treat an English syllable like a Japanese onji is to think about packing a suitcase.
Oh, I like this.
Imagine you have a strict rule. You must pack exactly 17 items in this specific suitcase. If you are packing 17 Japanese onji, it is like packing 17 pairs of thin cotton socks. It fits perfectly, the suitcase is light, it closes easily, and it functions exactly as intended. But if you try to pack 17 English syllables into that exact same suitcase, it is like trying to pack 17 thick, heavy, oversized winter coats.
Yeah, you can't do it.
The suitcase explodes, the zippers break, there is just way too much material crammed into a space that wasn't designed for it.
That is a brilliant analogy,
Yeah.
and it perfectly illustrates the crisis American poets faced when they tried to blindly follow the math. When early American poets forced themselves to hit a strict count of 17 English syllables, they quickly realized they were writing poems that were simply way too long. The brevity was gone.
Because they had too many coats.
Exactly. To hit that arbitrary 575 count, they had to stuff the poem with filler. They added unnecessary adjectives, prepositional phrases, and heavy descriptions just to make the math work out. It resulted in poems that critics correctly labeled as overly emotional, drawn out, and completely lacking the crisp, minimalist brevity that defined true Japanese haiku.
They were essentially padding their resumes just to hit an arbitrary word count. The poem didn't need the word very, but they needed 2 extra syllables, so they threw it in.
And that destroys the objective purity of the image. So the more astute American poets realized a hard truth. To preserve the true Japanese spirit of brevity in English, they had to write in fewer than 17 syllables.
Oh, interesting.
Studies of translation have actually shown that 17 Japanese onjanji usually convey about the same amount of information as roughly 10 to 14 English syllables.
That's a massive difference.
It is. They had to abandon the 575 rule to save the art form itself. And frankly, syllable counts weren't the only early misstep they had to correct. For a long time, Western translators and poets were trying to force rhymes onto the ends of the first and third lines.
Because that's what Western poetry does.
Right. Because in the Western literary tradition, if a poem didn't rhyme, audiences didn't think it was a real poem. They were also adding titles to their haikus, which is something Japanese haiku almost never does. Even the visual formatting had to be adapted. Japanese haiku is traditionally written in a single vertical line down the page. Western haiku, largely due to how our language is printed left to right, settled on the 3 horizontal lines we are familiar with today.
It's amazing how much trial and error was involved. You have these American writers essentially stumbling around in the dark, trying to force fit a square peg into a round hole before realizing they needed to just carve a new hole.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a critical turning point in the late 1960s. At this point in the timeline, the landscape is a mess. You have people writing bloated 17-syllable poems, you have people adding rhyme schemes, you have people adding clever titles, and they are all calling their work haiku.
Total chaos.
The movement desperately needed someone to step in, slam a gavel, and lay down the law. It needed a centralized authority to separate the art from the amateur imitations.
And that centralized authority arrived in the winter of 1968 to 1969, with the founding of the Haiku Society of America, or the HSA.
Okay.
Harold Henderson, very fittingly, was named its first honorary president. The HSA became the clearinghouse for standards in American haiku. They took on the responsibility of defining what was legitimate, what was not, and they quickly realized they had a massive institutional problem on their hands. The public perception of haiku was completely warped by the educational system and the publishing industry.
How so?
Well, in the early 70s, the HSA looked at standard English dictionaries, the very books people turned to for objective truth, and realized that the official dictionary definitions of haiku were wildly misleading. They were still promoting the old, flawed, padded 575 concepts.
So the dictionaries themselves, the ultimate arbiters of the English language, were spreading the misinformation.
Yes.
That's a nightmare scenario for a literary group trying to establish serious academic standards. What was their solution?
They realized they had to go to war with the dictionary publishers.
I love that.
They formed a committee, a heavy-hitting committee consisting of Harold Henderson, William J. Higginson, and Anita Virgil. Their mandate was to draft a strict, academically sound, linguistically accurate definition of haiku in English, and then relentlessly pressure the dictionary publishers to adopt it. This effort resulted in the famous 1972 definition.
Okay, let's look at the exact wording. What did this 1972 definition actually decree?
The 1972 definition formally defined haiku in English as an adaptation of Japanese pattern, usually written in 3 lines. But the critical phrase was this: it mandated that the poem be written in fewer than 17 syllables.
Wow, okay.
With that one phrase, they completely dethroned the 575 rule in official print. Furthermore, it specifically mandated that the poem must be unrhymed, and that its core purpose was to record the essence of a deeply realized moment that intimately links nature to human nature.
If you are listening to this right now and you think back to the poems you wrote in high school, you probably relied heavily on rhyme to make your writing sound poetic. Rhyme is the safety net of Western poetry. So I want to drill down into why the HSA felt the need to explicitly ban it in an official dictionary definition. Why take such a hardline stance against something so fundamental to English literature?
Because the HSA understood the psychological effect that rhyme has on a reader, and how that effect fundamentally contradicts the goal of haiku.
Okay.
In Western poetry, rhyme is the scaffolding holding the poem together. But in haiku, that sonic scaffolding becomes a massive obstacle. Think about what happens when you decide you must rhyme the word cat with the word hat.
You're forcing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are no longer observing reality. You are artificially manipulating language to serve a preconceived sonic pattern. You start making word choices based on sound, rather than the objective truth of the image you are trying to convey. Rhyme inherently creates a closed loop of sound that signals to the reader, look at how clever I am. This is artifice.
Yeah, it shows the author's hand.
It pads the poem, making it decorative and overly emotional. By explicitly banning rhyme, the HSA was executing a surgical strike designed to sever haiku from the traditional Western poetic tradition. Haiku wants to be a clear window pane looking out at reality, not a stained glass window drawing attention to itself. You are not here to write a clever rhyming jingle. You're here to get out of the way and record a deeply realized moment.
That reframes it entirely. It forces the poet to rely entirely on the strength of the image, rather than relying on a cheap audio trick to create rhythm. And to enforce these incredibly strict new standards, the HSA couldn't just rely on dictionary definitions. They needed a proving ground, right? A place where poets could test these theories.
Yes, they needed an arena. In 1978, the HSA established a journal called Frog Pond.
Great name.
Frog Pond became the ultimate testing ground for American haiku. It was where the strict new standards of fewer than 17 syllables, no rhyme, and deep imagistic focus were tested, debated, and published. It created a unified, serious literary community that finally agreed upon what constituted high-quality haiku, balancing technical craftsmanship with that deep, intuitive perception of a moment in nature.
All right, so let me synthesize where we are. The HSA has laid down the law. A true haiku is short, it does not rhyme, it is actively fewer than 17 syllables, it relies on concrete, objective imagery rather than abstract emotion, and its entire purpose is to capture this profound, deeply realized moment that connects the natural world to human nature.
That is the established gold standard for the English language form.
Which leads me to a very practical, everyday question.
Get me?
If that rigorous, profound definition is what makes a true haiku, what exactly are all those funny little 575 poems that people are constantly posting on social media? Or the poems people submit to the office newsletter, joking about their morning commute or complaining about their kids? You know exactly the type of poem I mean. The humorous, sarcastic, everyday observations, formatted into 3 lines. If those lack the nature connection and the profound realization, what are they? Are they just bad haikus?
They aren't bad haikus at all. They belong to an entirely different genre.
Wait, really?
Yeah. This is perhaps the most illuminating and practical part of Charles Trumbull's essay. It turns out Japanese poetry has specific, formalized names for those exact types of poems. They are considered the cousins of haiku. Specifically, we need to examine the differences between haiku, senryu, and zappai.
Haiku, senryu, and zappai. Okay, let's break these down. Tell me about senryu first.
Senryu is widely considered the close relative, or perhaps the witty sibling, of haiku. Structurally, it looks very similar, but the philosophical difference is vast. While haiku looks outward at the natural world to find a profound, transcendent connection to human nature, senryu turns its gaze entirely inward. It focuses exclusively on human affairs, human flaws, and societal interactions. Senryu is the poetry of the human comedy. It is characterized by irony, parody, cynicism, humor, psychological insight, and sometimes even casual vulgarity. And critically, because it is focused on human society rather than the natural world, a senryu does not require a seasoned word. It doesn't need to anchor itself in nature at all.
So if I write a clever, observant, 3-line poem about how my husband stubbornly refuses to ask for directions when we are hopelessly lost on a road trip that is a senryu. It's an observation about human folly and stubbornness. It is not a haiku because there is no profound connection to the seasons.
Exactly. That is the perfect example of a senryu. It has genuine artistic merit, it requires keen observation, but it belongs to a genre dedicated to human critique. But then we get to the third cousin, zappai. And this is where things get problematic.
Zappai. The way you say it makes it sound almost like insult in the poetry world.
In the context of serious literature, it largely is. Zappai is the strictest, most rigid follower of the 5-7 5-syllable rule. But that's all it is. It is completely lacking the Zen moment, the deeply realized image of haiku, and it lacks the keen psychological insight of senryu.
Just empty?
Completely.
Ugh.
It is essentially a hollow shell of form without substance. Zappai is just a clever remark, a bit of shallow wordplay, or a generic social commentary that someone has artificially shoved into a 5-7-5-syllable count simply to prove they can do the math.
Okay, let me apply this to a real-world scenario. Let's say a corporate office decides to host an Earth Day haiku contest to boost morale. And Jim from accounting submits a poem that perfectly hits the 5-7-5-syllable count, but the poem is just a joke about how the printer in the break room is always jammed and out of toner.
We all know Jim.
We do. What Jim has written is not a haiku because it has nothing to do with nature. And it isn't even really a senryu because it lacks any deep psychological insight into the human condition. Jim is writing a zappai.
Jim is absolutely writing a zappai. And while Jim's joke might be funny in the break room, the tragedy, according to literary experts, is that these massive public corporate contests actually severely damage the public's understanding of the art form.
How so?
By rewarding zappai, by handing Jim a gift card and telling him his printer joke is a winning haiku just because he successfully counted out 17 syllables on his fingers, institutions reinforce the false narrative that haiku is nothing more than a math game rather than a profound, demanding artistic discipline.
It is genuinely fascinating how one little structural myth has created an entire culture of misapplied poetry. Trumbull's essay actually provides a really helpful matrix to keep these straight. If we look at the primary focus, haiku focuses on nature and the seasons. Senryu focuses on human nature and society. Zappai focuses on superficial social commentary or wordplay. If we look at the tone or style, haiku uses deep, resonant, imagistic language. Senryu is satirical, cynical, and humorous. Zappai is just trying to be clever. And if we look at the primary standard for success, the standard for haiku is successfully capturing a transcendent, fleeting moment of experience. The standard for senryu is providing an insightful, relatable human critique. And the standard for zappai is literally just adhering to the math of the 5-7-5-syllable count.
That matrix clarifies everything beautifully. Haiku's the soul. Senryu is the mind. Zappai is just the arithmetic. And seeing how easily the public defaults to zappai really makes you appreciate how fiercely the Haiku Society of America had to fight to protect the soul of the form.
Absolutely.
And importantly, that fight did not end with their initial dictionary victories in the 1970s. As we move out of the 20th century and into the new millennium, American haiku had matured significantly. It had spent decades practicing, refining its theories in journals like Frog Pond, and shaking off the training wheels of early translations. It was no longer just mimicking a foreign structure. It was ready to declare total, unequivocal literary independence.
And that official declaration of independence happened in 2004, right? The HSA realized their definition needed an upgrade.
Yes. By the early 2000s, the leadership of the HSA recognized that their 1972 definition, while incredibly groundbreaking and necessary for its time, was still somewhat tethered to the past and to defensive posturing. So a new committee was formed, featuring scholars Naomi Y. Brown, Lee Gurga, and the returning champion from the 72 committee, William J. Higginson.
The dream team.
Exactly. Their mandate was to officially update and finalize the definition of haiku for the 21st century.
Let's look at what they came up with. The 2004 definition states that an English language haiku is, quote, a short poem that uses imagistic language to convey the essence of an experience of nature or the season intuitively linked to the human condition.
So good.
Now, comparing the 1972 text to this 2004 text, there are some massive, highly intentional changes. First of all, they completely dropped the phrase fewer than 17 syllables. The math is entirely gone. Now it just says a short poem.
Consider the implications of that removal. By erasing any mention of syllables or numerical limits, the HSA was finally, permanently ending the math game. They were stating, unequivocally, that the spirit of extreme brevity is what matters, not an arbitrary numerical limit. It requires the poet to develop an intuitive sense of what is short enough to capture a single breath rather than relying on a calculator.
The second change I notice is a philosophical shift. In 1972, they talked about capturing a moment. In 2004, they changed that to conveying an experience that feels significantly deeper. A moment is just a static snapshot. An experience implies a lived emotional truth that resonates over time.
It moves haiku from being a mere photograph to being a profound engagement with the world. It acknowledges that the poet is not just a lifeless camera lens, but a human being whose internal condition is impacted by the external natural world.
But the biggest change, the one that really serves as that Declaration of Independence, is what they deleted from the very beginning of the definition.
Oh, this is the big one.
The 1972 definition started by explicitly calling American haiku an adaptation of a Japanese pattern. In 2004, that phrase is completely scrubbed. There is no mention of Japan at all.
And taking that a step further, removing the word adaptation, was the HSA officially planting their flag in the ground. It was the culmination of Harold Henderson's theories from 50 years prior. It was their way of saying to the literary world, we are no longer just practicing a borrowed, diluted Japanese art form. English language haiku is now an autonomous, fully realized literary genre. It possesses its own rigorous aesthetic standards, its own history of evolution, and its own inherent validity. It was a monumental shift in self-perception.
I have to imagine that changing the fundamental definition of a revered, deeply traditional art form did not go over peacefully. There had to be traditionalists who lost their minds over the complete abandonment of the 17-syllable rule.
Oh, it was a highly contentious era. The American haiku community has always been incredibly fractured over the issue of form. While the HSA and the vast majority of modern published poets moved firmly toward this free-form minimalism, there were absolute fortresses of traditionalism that fought back bitterly against what they saw as the degradation of the art.
Like who?
Well, for instance, the Yuki Taikei Haiku Society, which was established back in 1975, they existed almost entirely to defend and aggressively enforce the strict 17-syllable rule in English, as well as the mandatory inclusion of traditional season words.
They were basically the syllable police, refusing to acknowledge the linguistic differences we discussed earlier.
They were steadfast in their adherence to the math. And conservative journals like American Haiku often served as bastions for these traditionalists to publish work that met those strict numerical criteria. The debates in letters to the editor and critical essays were fierce, and honestly, echoes of those debates continue to this day in certain circles.
I can imagine.
But the 2004 definition by the HSA largely set the trajectory and the accepted academic standard for the modern era of English haiku.
So American haiku fights these bitter internal wars, and it finally achieves its independence. It figures out its own linguistic identity. But right as it finalizes that identity, the world completely changes around it. We enter the late 90s and early 2000s. The internet arrives.
And everything shifts.
Suddenly, geographical borders, which had defined how poetry evolved and remained isolated for centuries, simply ceased to exist. A poet in Chicago can instantly read a poem written by a poet in Tokyo or Buenos Aires. Haiku is suddenly forced to transition from a collection of isolated national movements into a truly global language.
The internet age was the final crucible for haiku, really forcing it to confront its deepest traditions. To understand how radical this global shift was, we have to look back at one of the oldest, most revered Japanese traditions, the Saijiki.
Okay, the Saijiki.
The Saijiki is a 300-year-old poetic almanac. It is essentially a massive, highly curated dictionary of specific, officially recognized seasonal words, the kigo that classical poets were required to use to indicate the season.
Right.
But here is the massive logistical problem. The traditional Japanese Saijiki is tied exclusively to Japanese geography, Japanese flora and fauna, and the highly specific microclimates of the Japanese islands.
Right. If you live in a tropical climate near the equator, or if you live in the southern hemisphere where the seasons are inverted, our 300-year-old book detailing exactly when the cherry blossoms bloom in Kyoto is totally useless to your daily reality.
Exactly. So, as haiku rapidly spread globally via internet forums and email lists, a massive aesthetic crisis emerged. How do you write a true nature-focused haiku if your local nature doesn't match the Japanese rulebook?
Right.
Are you supposed to write about snow if you live in the Amazon rainforest? This is where William J. Higginson stepped in once again to offer a visionary solution. He published a groundbreaking book called Haiku World, and within it, he proposed a radical new concept, an international Saijiki.
That's ambitious.
Very. Instead of rigid, geography-specific season words, he introduced the concept of keywords that transcend specific local climates.
If I'm looking out my window right now, whether I'm looking at a snowy street in Chicago, a dense forest in Germany, or a desert landscape in Arizona, how does a keyword work differently than a traditional season word?
A traditional Japanese season word might be a very specific species of Japanese cicada that only sings during the late weeks of August. It is hyperlocal. Higginson proposed keywords like the Milky Way, or ocean tide, or morning fog.
Ah.
The Milky Way is a phenomenon of the natural world that evokes a profound sense of scale and a connection to the universe. And crucially, It works equally well and is equally authentic, whether you are writing from a balcony in South Africa, a farm in Romania, or an apartment in New York City.
That is brilliant. It democratizes the poetry. It tells the global poet, your sky, your local environment, your reality is completely valid for haiku. You don't have to pretend you live in ancient Japan to write a profound poem.
Exactly.
And this global push really culminated in 1999, which the sources highlight as a massive watershed year for the international movement. Two major paradigm-shifting declarations were made that year, the Tokyo Manifesto and the Matsuyama Declaration. Let's unpack these, starting with the 1999 Tokyo Manifesto.
The Tokyo Manifesto was issued by the Modern Haiku Association in Japan, and it was a bold, highly progressive document aimed directly at establishing the soul and the aesthetic rules for a borderless art form. It officially declared that traditional localized season words were unnecessary for global haiku, formally endorsing Higginson's concept of borderless keywords.
Big step.
Huge. It explicitly prioritized absolute originality over adherence to classical imitation. But perhaps its most profound directive was that it urged global poets to exploit the unique sonic, rhythmic, and phonetic properties of their own native languages.
Oh, wow.
It essentially told the world, don't try to make your language sound Japanese. If your language is harsh and guttural, use that. If your language is incredibly fast and melodic, use that. Sound exactly like your language is supposed to sound.
That feels like the ultimate triumphant culmination of Harold Henderson's advice from 40 years earlier. It is the final permission slip for haiku to adapt to any tongue on earth. But then, in that very same year, you have the Matsuyama Declaration. If Tokyo was handling the aesthetics, what was Matsuyama doing?
If the Tokyo Manifesto was trying to build the aesthetic soul of global haiku, the Matsuyama Declaration was trying to build its physical and institutional infrastructure. The art form needed scaffolding to survive globally. Matsuyama focused entirely on institutions.
Like what?
It proposed the creation of a centralized international research center to archive the explosion of global haiku. It called for biennial international haiku festivals to bring poets from different continents together in person. And most ambitiously, it proposed the establishment of the Masaoka Shiki International Haiku Prize, which was explicitly envisioned and funded to be the Nobel Prize of Haiku.
The Nobel Prize of Haiku. That level of institutional ambition shows you just how seriously they were taking this on the world stage. They weren't treating it as a niche hobby, they were treating it as major world literature. And this global push, fueled by the internet and these declarations, undeniably worked. The sources detail haiku exploding across languages and cultures that possess completely different literary rhythms and traditions than either Japanese or English.
It was a massive, unprecedented success of cross-cultural fertilization. We see profound, thriving haiku movements in the Spanish-speaking world, famously championed by literary titans who recognized its power, like Jorge Luis Borges in Argentina and Octavio Paz in Mexico.
Amazing.
There is a massive, highly active Portuguese haiku community centered in Brazil, which has created a fascinating synthesis. They blend classical Asian poetic traditions with deeply rooted European and vibrant South American cultural influences. You can even look back historically to the 1920s and see the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore translating and adapting haiku into Bengali.
Just a completely global phenomenon.
Exactly. Today, the internet has realized the ultimate vision of those early pioneers. You have massive online hubs like Haiku Sans Frontières, Haiku, without borders, hosting, analyzing, and translating original haikus from 27 different distinct language communities, all gathered in one accessible digital space.
That is truly incredible. When you step back from the granular debates over syllables and definitions and look at the massive historical arc we've covered today, it's almost unbelievable.
It's a wild ride.
It is. We started with 3 French poets on a boat in a canal in 1903, playing with what they assumed was a neat little exotic parlor trick. We watched Ezra Pound seize upon its minimalist aesthetic to violently smash the bloated, sentimental Victorian poetry of his era. We saw the raw glamour, the Zen obsession, and the chaotic energy of the Beat generation popularizing it in America, while quiet, dedicated scholars like Henderson and Blythe built the actual academic foundation beneath them.
Right.
We waded through the fierce, bitter dictionary wars over linguistic metrics and learned why Jim's office printer joke is actually a zapai, not a haiku. And finally, we arrived at a borderless, internet-fueled global phenomenon where a poet in Brazil can share a fleeting, profound observation of nature with a poet in Romania, transcending both geography and language.
It serves as a profound testament to the sheer resilience of the core idea. Despite all the initial mistranslations, the massive cultural detours, the bitter structural debates, and the institutional gatekeeping, the fundamental human desire to capture a fleeting, profound moment of truth remained completely intact. That desire was strong enough to eventually conquer the globe.
It really was. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. We started this conversation thinking about haiku exactly the way we were taught as children, as a rigid mathematical 575 constraint, a box we had to fit our words into. But look at where this journey ended up. If modern global haiku has actively stripped away the strict syllable counts, if it has explicitly banned the artifice of rhyme, and if it has even discarded the traditional mandated season words, leaving behind absolutely nothing but the pure, unadorned essence of a deeply realized shared human experience intricately linked to the natural world around us, is haiku still just a specific form of poetry? Or, through all this intense, centuries-long evolution, has it actually evolved into something much larger and much more vital? Has it simply become a universal cognitive framework for how we pay attention to the world? Think about that the next time you catch yourself counting syllables on your fingers. Until next time.